Here we are. It's winter. It's cold, what do you expect? But no cold wind. I want to look at Australia's foreign policy today. Obviously, with the situation rapidly deteriorating in the Middle East, and with the pariah state Israel attacking all its neighbours, thinking that will give it security, I think it has a lot of lessons for a lot of people. But we tend to think, well, we're far away, it's got nothing to do with us. Don't forget the Iraq war and Australia's involvement in that. But when you move to a new place, it's always advantageous to get on with your neighbours, even if they have habits which you dislike, or even if you don't like them. There's nothing worse than being in constant warfare with your neighbours. Now, before European colonisation, First Nations people in this country basically lived in a relatively stable environment. And those to the north of Australia, for hundreds of years, had interactions with local Indonesian fishermen and Indonesian traders. And there's a history of hundreds of years of interaction between far north indigenous people and Indonesians. Obviously in the Torres Strait, you had interaction between what we call Papua New Guinea today and what we call the Torres Strait. As people from both areas were the same, relatively similar cultures. So with European colonisation, what we saw as Indigenous people were forcefully removed from the country, what we saw is a siege mentality developed. Not just a siege mentality in terms of the interaction and the constant frontier wars which occurred for over 150 years, but a isolationism based on a European colonisation. And if you look at the history of early Australia, especially after Federation, the 1st of January 1901, you can see that as a sovereign nation state, we saw ourselves as part of Europe. And the majority of the colonisers came from Europe. So we felt, believed that we were in a totally hostile environment, surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who spoke different languages, different cultures, different religions. And as we were the new kids on the block, as we were able to successfully dispossess this country's original inhabitants, we looked to Europe, not just culturally, but saw ourselves as part of the European civilization, an outpost of European civilization on the rim of Asia. Now obviously, this didn't really highlight the true situation, because the true situation was that in Northern Australia, whether it was West Australia, Northern Territory or Queensland, communities had built up from multiracial origins, and most of these communities came about because the colonisers required cheap labour. So we saw indentured labourers come into the country, whether they were Malays, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese. So in many regards, Northern Australia was a multiracial society before Federation. And when Federation occurred on the 1st of January 1901, the first piece of legislation which went through Parliament was the White Australia policy, or you could call it the European-only policy. Although Southern Europeans at that particular point in time, people from Greece and Italy, were not really considered to be European, but that's a different story. So here we have this European outpost in a sea all adrift in a new geographical area which we as a nation took little notice of, thinking that Mother England would be able to defend us in case the yellow hordes, their words not mine, invaded this country. Now Australia's European population, considering this is a continent, was relatively small. By World War I it was around 5 million, well it was less than, around 3 to 4 million people. A relatively small, sorry, it was around 5 million people, a relatively small population. And the hysteria which occurred with the announcement of war in 1914 highlighted how much we fought as a country that we were part of Europe. And from a population of 5 million people, 420,000 young Australian men volunteered to fight in the war to end all wars in Europe. And of those 420,000, 62,000 died on the European killing fields. Another 60,000 died of their injuries by the time they came home, and many were affected, and their families and children and grandchildren were affected by generations. But this was what was described as the blood sacrifice of a nation, that we owed it to Mother England, that we owed it to Great Britain to fight in that war, forgetting that we were part of Asia, that we are on the rim of Asia. Now obviously while the colonial process, the European colonial process, continued to expand between world wars, whether it's Dutch colonisation or British colonisation or German colonisation before World War I. Because remember, Papua New Guinea, that New Guinea was actually a German colony which was ceded to Australia after the Germans lost World War I. So we have this colonial expansion between the world wars. And when World War II broke out, we were faced with the same dilemma. And the dilemma was that we felt that we were part of the British Empire. Not felt, but were part of the British Empire. And although a Labor government had been elected at the beginning of the war, most of Australia's fighting troops were sent to fight in Europe. And when the Japanese imperial forces began their march down from Japan through Asia, through Thailand, through Malaysia, through Singapore, to the northern reaches of Australia, there were no battle-hardened troops to defend this country. And at that particular point in time, in 1941-42, the Australian government made a critical decision. It made the critical decision to withdraw Australia's troops back from Europe and North Africa to Australia to help defend the nation from what was seen as a possible Japanese invasion of this country. Let's not forget that during World War II, hundreds, if not thousands, of Australians were killed through bombing raids by the Japanese in Darwin, Broome, North Australia, the Torres Strait, and that even two-man submarines were able to enter Sydney Harbour, and ships were torpedoed outside Orbost. So what occurred is, with the introduction of conscription, that a larger number of men were then available to fight the Japanese imperial forces in New Guinea. And with United States assistance, and let's not forget, the United States only entered the war. They didn't enter the war in 1939. They only entered the war after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese imperial forces. So at the end of World War II, governments and most Australians realised that unless the country was populated, there was no chance of defending the country. You can't defend a country like Australia with a population at the end of World War II of around 10 million people. And a new policy was introduced, the populate or perish policy. Unfortunately, after World War II, we had learnt very little. The world was changing. Our region was changing. Colonial entities were disintegrating. The Dutch, who had colonised Indonesia, or the islands that make up Indonesia, for over 400 years, found themselves fighting against Indonesian nationalists at the end of World War II. It didn't take long for Indonesia to agree to Indonesian independence, although they kept West Papua in their hands, or Indonesian Netherlands in their hands till 1967. You had independence movements in Thailand, in Burma, in Malaysia. Singapore broke away from Malaysia. You had independence movements in Cambodia or Kampuchea, Vietnam, and although the French attempted to maintain their Vietnamese colonies, they were finally evicted, and when the United States became embroiled in a war that lasted over 20 years, they were also evicted by 1975. So around our geographical area, things had changed dramatically, but our policies had not. Our defence policies as a nation had not changed one iota. We still saw ourselves as a European outpost in a hostile environment. And we saw Australian troops being engaged in a number of wars. In Malaysia during the Malayan emergency, when the communist forces were attempting to become the major force there. In Vietnam, where over 520 Australians were killed, many of them conscripts. So we are still, and those of us who are old enough to remember will remember the stories of the yellow hordes. They should go from China to Vietnam to Thailand to Malaysia and then invade this country. So there was this mentality that we were not part of this region. And that's the moral of the story. When you move to a new area, whether you like it or not, you are part of that region and you need to accommodate to that region. Obviously, the smaller Pacific Island nation states, apart from New Zealand, which saw itself as a European outpost, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Kiribati, and the list goes on and on. Fiji, we tended to ignore these new emerging nation states. And over the last 10 to 15 years, during the Liberal National Party government of Morrison and Turnbull, we saw this nation turn its back on our Pacific neighbours, somehow thinking we were still part of Europe. Today we face the same problem. We still think we're a European outpost, although the makeup of this country has increased dramatically as the racial composition changes, as more and more immigrants are required from other parts of the world, especially Asia, to fill the vacuums that occurred in this country because of a lack, to a significant degree, of training of local people. But getting back to the main argument, we now see ourselves as part of the United States. The election of the buffoon in Washington has highlighted to us as a nation, not to you and me, obviously we knew this, but to governments, that you cannot rely on outside forces to protect you, despite these outside forces having military bases in North Australia, with having espionage centres like Pine Gap, which are part and parcel of the military-industrial complex outside Alice Springs. And what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years is an increasing number of United States troops stationed in North Australia, and an increasing, almost total reliance on the military-industrial complex in the United States to provide the necessary armaments for defence of the country. And somehow thinking, by attaching our coattails to the United States, that they would look after our interests. The reality is, as the buffoon has said, it's America first, and it's always been America first. So just lately, in the last year or two, federal governments are beginning to realise that we are part of this geographical entity. And in order to secure our security, we need to interact with the people around us, with the nation states around us, whether it's providing aid to emerging nation states in the Pacific, who have great difficulty because of a lack of natural resources in looking after themselves, or whether it's entering into relationships, not just based on defence, but relationships which are bicultural relationships, relationships which are based on economics, with the sovereign nation states around this continent. You can't attach a tugboat to the Australian continent, and drag it up to the Western USA. We are part of this region, and unless we interact and find some accommodation with both small and large powers in this region, we will continue to be at the behest of the United States country that continues to use force to build an empire outside its borders to provide it with the resources that they require. So we are at a critical juncture in Australian society. Do we continue to look towards Big Brother or Big Sister to protect us in the schoolyard at lunchtime? Or are we going to develop our own defence capabilities, move away from the United States, not just in terms of alliances, but in terms of equipment, in terms of building relationships, especially with those countries in our region that will not go away?